The night was still, the cold metal of the ATM keypad echoing beneath her fingertips. A shadow moved behind her, silent, predatory. But the thief had no idea that she wasn't alone. A low, guttural growl shattered the silence. The night air was thick with the scent of damp asphalt, a lingering chill clinging to the quiet streets. Olivia Monroe tightened her grip on the worn leather leash in her hand, her heartbeat steady, but her mind restless. She had always hated withdrawing cash this late, but life didn't always allow for convenience. The neon glow of the ATM screen cast a pale blue light against her face as she keyed in her PIN. Beside her, Titan stood tall and unmoving, his sable coat sleek beneath the dim streetlights. He wasn't just a pet. He was a trained K-9, a partner she had depended on during her years as a police officer. Though she had left the force after an injury, Titan's instincts had never dulled. He stood alert, his muscular frame tensed, ears flicking at the slightest sound. Olivia exhaled, brushing away the ghosts of old memories. Life after law enforcement had been an adjustment, but she had found a strange kind of peace in the simplicity of routine. Walks with Titan, quiet evenings, and the ever-present hum of the city at night. But tonight, something felt different. A whisper of unease traced its way down her spine. She glanced around. The street was nearly empty, save for a flickering street lamp a few yards away. A single car sat parked at the curb, engine silent. Too silent. Titan shifted, his ears standing straight, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Olivia's pulse quickened, a subtle but familiar adrenaline rush creeping into her veins. She knew better than to ignore his signals. Sliding the withdrawn bills into her pocket, she turned, quickening her pace. Titan moved in sync with her, his powerful body brushing against her leg in silent reassurance. Then, just as she reached for her car door, a shadow moved. A sharp, calculated movement in the corner of her vision. Olivia turned, muscles coiling. The scent of sweat and cheap cologne hit her senses a split second before the voice did. "Wallet, now!" The words were gritted, low, edged with the cocky confidence of someone who thought he had the upper hand. A man, mid-30s, rough around the edges with a hood pulled low over his forehead, stepped closer. His hand twitched near his pocket. A weapon? Maybe. But Olivia didn't need to see it to know she was in danger. Titan let out a low growl, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. The man hesitated, his bravado faltering for just a moment, but not enough. "Did you hear me?" he snapped, voice laced with irritation. He reached forward, closing the space between them. Olivia didn't move, not yet. Her mind worked fast, calculating. The angle, the distance, the weight of Titan at her side. He was waiting, just as she had trained him to, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. The man sneered. "Lady, don't make me ask again." A fatal mistake. Titan lunged. Olivia had trained with Titan for years, and she knew what came next would be over in seconds. The force of his leap was like a coiled spring snapping loose, his powerful legs propelling him forward as his teeth locked onto the man's forearm. A howl of pain split the night, raw and desperate. The thief staggered backward, his free hand clawing at Titan's fur, trying and failing to shake him loose. Panic flared in the man's eyes, his initial bravado replaced with sheer terror. He hadn't expected this, hadn't seen the threat that had been standing right in front of him. He stumbled, his back hitting the cold concrete wall of the ATM booth as Titan drove him further into submission. Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't have to. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew the balance of power had shifted completely. "Bad choice," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You shouldn't have come near me." The man whimpered, his arrogance crumbling. "Call him off, please." Titan's grip tightened just slightly, his deep growl reverberating in the night air, a warning that he wasn't done yet. Olivia tilted her head, considering. The adrenaline rush had settled, leaving her hyper-aware of every detail. The man's rapid, shallow breaths, the acrid scent of fear in the air, the weight of Titan's tense muscles beneath her touch as she reached down and ran a hand along his back. "Drop," she ordered, her voice sharp and practiced. Titan obeyed instantly, releasing the man's arm and stepping back, but his body remained taut, eyes locked onto the threat, ready to strike again if given the signal. The man gasped, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his sleeve where Titan's teeth had sunk in, but the damage wasn't severe. Controlled precision, just enough to incapacitate, not enough to maim. Olivia took a step forward, and the man flinched. "Get up," she said, her tone even. He hesitated, but one glance at Titan, who hadn't moved, still poised and watching, was enough. He scrambled to his feet, wobbling slightly. Olivia pulled her phone from her pocket. "You have two choices," she said. "Option 1, I call the cops. Option 2, you run, and you pray we never cross paths again." The man swallowed hard, staring at her, then at Titan. He took a shaky step backward, then another, and then, with a strangled curse, he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Titan huffed, a satisfied sound, as if he had been hoping for a little more action. Olivia chuckled, scratching behind his ear. "Good boy," she murmured. The street was silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the ATM. Olivia exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had always told herself she wasn't the same woman she had been on the force, but some things never changed. And neither did Titan. She glanced down at him. He looked up at her with those steady, knowing eyes, his tail wagging slightly. A silent understanding passed between them. As they turned toward home, Olivia knew one thing for certain. No matter where life took her, no matter how much time passed, she would never be alone. Olivia's heart was still pounding, but her steps were measured as she walked away from the ATM, Titan at her side. The night had fallen into its usual quiet hum, but the lingering adrenaline in her veins refused to let her settle. She had been in situations like this before, but this time was different. This time she wasn't in uniform, wasn't carrying a badge or a gun, just a leash, a dog, and instincts that had never dulled. Titan padded along beside her, his ears still alert, his breath even. He had done his job flawlessly, like he always did. But Olivia knew the man wouldn't forget this night. The look of raw terror in his eyes as Titan had pinned him to the ground, it was burned into her memory. As they reached her car, Olivia opened the door and let Titan hop inside before sliding in herself. She took a deep breath, rubbing a hand over her face. It was over. But something in her gut twisted, an instinctive pull telling her that this wasn't just some random mugging. Something about the man's demeanor nagged at her. She started the car, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The streets were empty, washed in dim amber light. As she pulled away from the curb, she checked her rearview mirror. The lot was still, the ATM screen flickering in the distance. No sign of the man. But then, something caught her eye. A car, idling at the far end of the lot. No headlights on, just sitting there, barely visible in the darkness. Olivia's pulse ticked higher. Had it been there before? She hadn't noticed it when she arrived. Her cop instincts flared to life, warning her that this wasn't just paranoia. She turned out onto the main road, driving slow at first, watching the rearview mirror. The car didn't move. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it belonged to someone sleeping inside, some drifter looking for a quiet place to park. But the longer she drove, the more uneasy she felt. A few blocks later, Olivia turned onto a quieter street, one lined with shuttered storefronts and dimly lit alleyways. And that's when she saw it. Headlights. The car had pulled out and was following her. She forced herself to stay calm. There were a dozen reasons why someone might be driving the same route. Coincidence. A late-night commuter heading in the same direction. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't over. Titan let out a soft whine from the back seat, sensing her tension. Olivia's grip on the wheel tightened. She couldn't go home. Not yet. If this guy had backup, if this was more than just an attempted mugging, the last thing she wanted was to lead them to where she lived. Her mind worked fast. She needed to lose them. She took a sudden right turn down a narrow street, pushing the speed limit just slightly. The car behind her hesitated, just for a second, before following. Not a coincidence. Olivia exhaled sharply, forcing her nerves to settle. She had dealt with worse, but she wasn't about to take this lightly. She spotted an upcoming intersection where an old gas station sat on the corner. Its bright, flickering lights cast long shadows across the pavement. She made her decision in a split second. Instead of slowing down for the turn, she sped up. Then, at the last second, slammed the brakes and swerved hard to the right. Tires screeched against asphalt as her car veered sharply into the gas station lot, narrowly avoiding the pump islands. She cut the engine, killed the lights, and ducked low in her seat. Titan let out a soft, eager huff, but he remained still, waiting. The other car came into view. It slowed as it passed, creeping down the street. Olivia barely breathed, watching as it hesitated just for a moment before continuing on. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. The car disappeared down the road, its red taillights melting into the darkness. Olivia exhaled, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. This wasn't just some desperate thief looking for quick cash. Someone was watching her, and she needed to find out who. Olivia stayed in the car a little longer, watching the street, listening to Titan's steady breathing in the back seat. Her heartbeat had settled, but her mind was still racing. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. The thief back at the ATM had been sloppy, but this? The car following her? That wasn't a coincidence. She reached for her phone and pulled up the security app linked to the cameras outside her house. Everything looked normal, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Titan let out a small, low growl, not of aggression, but of awareness. He sensed it too. She turned the key in the ignition, pulling back onto the road. This time, she didn't go home. She drove instead to the one place she knew she could get some answers. 20 minutes later, Olivia pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind an old boxing gym. The place had seen better days. Its once bold sign faded from years of sun and rain. But inside, she knew she'd find someone who could help. She stepped out of the car, Titan following closely, his leash wrapped loosely around her wrist. The gym's back door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the night. Olivia pushed it open and stepped inside. The air smelled of sweat and leather, of old wooden floors and faded glory. At the far end of the gym, a man in his 50s stood wrapping his hands, his gray hair slicked back, a scar running from his jaw to his temple. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Olivia Monroe," he said, setting down the roll of tape. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here," she admitted, stepping closer. "But I need a favor." He studied her for a long moment, then glanced down at Titan. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Whatever it is," he said, "must be serious if you're bringing the big guy." Olivia crossed her arms. "Someone tried to mug me tonight." His expression darkened. "You okay?" "Fine," she said. "But there's more. Someone followed me afterward. A car. They tailed me for 6 blocks. He exhaled slowly. "You get a plate?" "Too dark, but I know the type. Black sedan, tinted windows. The kind people use when they don't want to be seen." The man, Frank, an old contact from her police days, nodded, his jaw tight. "Sounds like professionals." "That's what I'm worried about." Olivia glanced around the gym, the memories of her past life pressing in on her. "I need information, fast." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his chin. "I'll see what I can dig up." She nodded, but the unease in her gut didn't fade. Something told her this was just the beginning. and whoever was behind it wasn't finished with her yet. Frank leaned against the edge of the boxing ring, rubbing his hands together as he considered Olivia's words. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked toward Titan, who stood rigid beside her, ears twitching at the faintest sound in the empty gym. "This isn't just some desperate street thug," Frank muttered, his voice carrying the weight of years spent navigating the underbelly of the city. "Someone followed you? In a car like that? Feels organized." Olivia crossed her arms, her gut already telling her the same thing. "That's what I was thinking, but I don't know why. I haven't been on the force in years. I don't make enemies anymore." Frank gave her a pointed look. "You don't have to make enemies for them to remember you." She hated that he was right. The city had its fair share of criminals who bore grudges, but she had left all that behind, hadn't she? Frank let out a breath, shaking his head. "Look, I'll check with some people. See if any names pop up that might have a reason to come after you." Olivia nodded. "I'd appreciate it." "Until then, lay low," Frank warned. "If they followed you once, they might try again." That was the part that unsettled her the most. Titan let out a low rumble, shifting closer to her leg. Olivia ran a hand over his head, grounding herself. "I can take care of myself." Frank smirked. "Never said you couldn't. Just saying, don't get reckless." Reckless wasn't in her vocabulary, but as she left the gym and climbed into her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't in control of this situation, not yet. She took a different route home, weaving through back streets, doubling back twice to make sure she wasn't being followed. Titan sat silently in the back seat, his eyes never leaving the road. By the time she pulled into her driveway, exhaustion tugged at her limbs. Her small house sat in darkness, the porch light flickering slightly, casting uneven shadows against the front door. Olivia stepped out of the car, Titan close on her heels. She unlocked the door and pushed it open, letting Titan enter first, a habit from years of working together, his presence always acting as an extra set of eyes. The house was exactly as she had left it, quiet, still, undisturbed. But the feeling in her gut hadn't gone away. She locked the door behind her and checked the security cameras again. Nothing unusual, just the empty street, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. She sighed and sat down on the couch, Titan settling beside her. Tomorrow, she'd start digging. If someone was watching her, she needed to know who and why. Morning came too quickly, sunlight spilling through the blinds in golden streaks. Olivia woke with a stiff back, still curled on the couch where she had fallen asleep, Titan resting at her feet. The unease hadn't faded. After a quick shower, she poured herself a cup of coffee and pulled out her laptop. If Frank was asking around, she could do her own digging in the meantime. She started with recent crimes in the area, ATM robberies, carjackings, anything that might fit. Nothing stood out. But then she searched deeper. A name popped up that sent ice through her veins. Jason Varga. It had been years since she last heard it. Back when she was still on the force, Varga had been one of the most dangerous men operating in the city's underground, trafficking, extortion, and worse. He had slipped through their fingers more times than she could count, but they had finally put him away 6 years ago. So why was his name surfacing now? A news article filled in the blanks. Jason Varga, released after overturned conviction. Olivia's stomach tightened. She read on, skimming the details. New evidence had come to light, casting doubt on his original conviction. The case had been reopened, and the courts had ruled in his favor. He was free. And if he was free, that meant he had a score to settle. She closed the laptop, her pulse pounding. It made sense now. If Varga was back, he wouldn't have forgotten the people responsible for putting him away. Olivia had been one of the officers on that case. She reached for her phone and dialed Frank. He picked up after the first ring. "I was just about to call you." "You found something?" Olivia asked, already knowing the answer. "Not me." "Someone else did," Frank muttered. Word on the street is Varga's been asking about you. Wants to tie up loose ends. Olivia let out a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. And I'm at the top of the list. Looks that way, Frank confirmed. He's got people watching, seeing if you're alone, if you're still a threat. You might have scared off that punk last night, but I doubt that was random. He was probably sent to test you. It all lined up. The mugging, the car following her, the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her since last night. Varga was behind it. What's my next move? She asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. You've got two options. You run, you disappear, go off the grid for a while. Olivia's jaw tightened. Not happening. Didn't think so, Frank muttered. Then you make a move first. Titan let out a soft growl as if he understood the weight of the conversation. Olivia reached down, running a hand over his fur. She had spent years enforcing the law, bringing criminals like Varga to justice. But she wasn't a cop anymore. She had no badge, no department backing her. This time she was on her own, and that meant playing by her own rules. I'm not going to sit back and wait for him to come to me, Olivia said, her voice steady. I'm going to find him first. Frank chuckled. Now that's the Olivia I remember? She hung up, her mind already working. If Varga wanted to test her, she'd give him his answer. But she wasn't going to play defense. She was going to bring the fight to him. Dark night of the soul. The city felt different now. Every passing car, every flickering streetlight, every shadowed alley carried a weight Olivia couldn't ignore. Jason Varga was back, and he wasn't the type to let old grudges fade. He had been watching her, testing her, and now it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. Titan sensed her unease. He stayed closer than usual, his head constantly turning, ears flicking at even the faintest sound. Olivia had learned to trust his instincts. When he was on edge, it meant danger was near. She had spent years facing down criminals, but this was different. She wasn't a cop anymore. There was no badge to flash, no backup to call in, no department resources to lean on. It was just her, Titan, and a past she thought she had outrun. But Varga hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The weight of it pressed down on her as she drove through the city, taking back roads and side streets, making sure she wasn't being followed. Frank had offered to pull some strings, maybe get her a safe house, but Olivia had refused. She wasn't running. Instead, she had spent the past few hours digging through old case files, reading through everything she had on Varga. His connections, his routines, the people who still owed him favors. If she could predict his next move, she could get ahead of him. But no matter how much she searched, one fact remained the same. Jason Varga was smart. He was meticulous, and he had spent years in prison thinking about all the people who had put him there. By the time she pulled up to her house, exhaustion tugged at her, but she forced herself to stay sharp. She had parked a block away and walked the rest of the way, Titan at her side. Her street was quiet, too quiet. The usual city noise, passing cars, distant sirens, seemed muffled, as if the world had been holding its breath. Something was wrong. Her grip tightened on Titan's leash as she approached her house. The porch light was off. She always left it on. A warning bell rang in her mind. Titan let out a low growl. Olivia stepped onto the porch, her muscles coiled, every nerve in her body screaming at her to be ready. She reached for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, a sharp click echoed behind her, the sound of a gun being cocked. She froze. Hands where I can see them. A voice she didn't recognize, male, steady, cold. Slowly, Olivia raised her hands. Titan stiffened beside her, every muscle in his body tensed, waiting for her command. "Turn around," the man ordered. She did. A figure stood in the shadows near the edge of her porch, dressed in black, face obscured by the darkness. But Olivia could see the gun in his hand, aimed directly at her chest. "Varga sends his regards," he said. tilting his head slightly. You've been asking a lot of questions. That's a problem. Olivia's mind raced. He wasn't here to kill her, not yet. If that had been the goal, he wouldn't have bothered talking. That meant he wanted something. Varga doesn't need to do this, she said carefully, stalling for time. I'm not a threat to him. The man chuckled. Yeah? That's not what he thinks. He took a step closer. Titan growled, low and menacing. The man hesitated, glancing at the dog for the first time. That thing moves, I put a bullet in both of you. Olivia felt Titan's muscles quiver under her grip. He was waiting for her signal. And she was waiting for the right opening. The man was too confident. He wasn't holding the gun steady anymore, wasn't expecting a fight. She could use that. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and Olivia used the distraction. With a sharp whistle, her old K9 command, Titan lunged. The man barely had time to react before Titan's weight crashed into him, jaws snapping around his forearm. The gun fired, the sound deafening in the night. Pain ripped through Olivia's shoulder. She stumbled back, biting down a scream. The bullet had grazed her, just a graze, but the pain was sharp and immediate. Titan didn't let go. He had the man pinned, teeth sinking deeper, growls turning savage. The attacker was screaming now, thrashing against the concrete, the gun knocked from his grasp. Olivia gritted her teeth against the pain and moved fast, kicking the gun out of reach before pressing a knee into the man's chest. He gasped, wheezing. She pressed harder. Who else is coming? He coughed, shaking his head. You don't get it. It's not just you. He's going after everyone. The words sent ice through her veins. Everyone. Frank, the other officers from the case, the people who had helped put Varga away. This wasn't just revenge, it was a full-blown war. Olivia's vision blurred slightly from the pain, but she didn't let up. Where is he? The man groaned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Doesn't matter, you won't make it that far. Titan snarled, and the man flinched. But before Olivia could press further, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Someone had heard the gunshot. She cursed under her breath. She didn't have time for the cops. She stood, pulling Titan back, but not before giving him one last command. Stay. Titan obeyed, still baring his teeth at the man on the ground. Olivia turned and ran. She didn't look back. The sirens grew louder as she disappeared into the night. She had only one thought in her mind now. This wasn't just about her anymore. Varga was coming for all of them, and she was going to stop him before it was too late. Blood soaked through Olivia's jacket, warm against her skin, but she didn't stop moving. The city blurred around her as she weaved through the empty streets, Titan bounding at her side. She had no plan, only instincts. She couldn't go home, couldn't go to a hospital, couldn't let herself slow down. Varga's men had come for her, and she had barely made it out alive, but she wasn't the only target. Frank. The realization hit her like ice water. If Varga was going after everyone who had a hand in his conviction, Frank was next. Ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, Olivia pulled out her phone and called Frank. The line rang once, twice. Then he picked up. You better have good news. Frank's voice was gruff, but something was off. He sounded winded, strained. Where are you? Olivia demanded. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing, he muttered. Because I just had a visitor. Big guy, ugly scar on his chin. Didn't knock. A pit formed in Olivia's stomach. You okay? Yeah. For now, Frank grunted. But I think your little theory was right. Varga's cleaning house. Where are you now? At the gym. Figured if they came back, I'd rather be somewhere I could fight. I'm on my way. Liv, wait. But she had already hung up. She didn't have time for warnings. Titan whined as if sensing her urgency, but he didn't slow. He never did. The drive to the gym was a blur, her fingers white-knuckled around the wheel. Every dark alley, every set of headlights in her rearview mirror felt like a threat. But she didn't care. She had one goal now, End this. The gym looked the same as it always had. Old, run down, barely held together by the sweat and stubbornness of the people who trained there. But something felt wrong. The door was ajar. Titan growled, his hackles rising. Olivia drew in a steady breath and reached for the knife strapped to her belt. A gun would have been better, but she hadn't been carrying since she left the force. Now she regretted it. She moved inside, slow and silent. The gym was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of a flickering overhead light. She stepped forward, scanning the room. A shadow moved. She turned just in time. A fist came out of nowhere, slamming into her ribs, sending her staggering back. The pain in her shoulder flared white-hot, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. Her attacker, big, bald, a jagged scar across his cheek, came at her again. This time, she was ready. She ducked low, twisting around him, and drove her elbow into his side. He grunted, stumbling, but recovered fast. He swung again. She dodged. Titan lunged. The man barely had time to react before 100 pounds of trained muscle crashed into him. He went down hard, Titan's teeth snapping just inches from his throat. "Call him off!" the man wheezed, his eyes wide with panic. Olivia stepped closer, her voice cold. "Where's Varga?" The man's jaw clenched. Titan growled, pressing down harder. "I don't know," he gasped. "Varga doesn't tell us where he is. He's been moving around, staying off the grid." She studied him, searching for a lie. Then, a noise. A gun cocking. Olivia reacted on instinct. She grabbed Titan's harness and dove to the side just as a shot rang out. The bullet hit the wall where she had been standing. She rolled, coming up fast. Another figure stood in the doorway. A second attacker, gun raised. Olivia didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby weight from the gym floor and hurled it. The dumbbell struck the man's wrist with a sickening crack. He cried out, the gun clattering to the ground. Titan was on him in seconds. The man went down, screaming. Olivia didn't wait. She turned back to the first attacker, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. "Varga's next move," she hissed. "Tell me, now." The man hesitated, panting. He's waiting for you." Something in her stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes flicked to the floor. This was a trap. The realization hit like a freight train. Frank. She had left him alone. She turned and ran. She didn't remember getting into the car, didn't remember starting the engine. Her body moved on autopilot, every nerve in her body screaming too late, too late, too late. She had walked right into Varga's plan. And now, Frank was paying for it. Titan whined in the back seat, his nails scraping against the floor. He could feel it too. The gym hadn't been the target. She was. And Varga had been waiting for her to take the bait. The moment she pulled up to Frank's street, she knew something was wrong. The front door was wide open. No lights. No sound. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. She parked haphazardly and bolted from the car, Titan bounding ahead of her. The porch creaked under her weight as she moved inside, heart pounding. "Frank?" Silence. Then, a low groan. She moved fast, sweeping through the house. The place was wrecked. Furniture overturned, papers scattered. In the living room, Frank was slumped against the wall, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. She dropped to her knees. Hey, stay with me." Frank let out a weak chuckle. "Took you long enough." "What happened?" "Varga," he muttered. "His guys showed up right after you left. Told me to send you a message." Olivia's stomach tightened. "What message?" Frank's eyes met hers. "You can't run from him." A chill crawled down her spine. She knew what this meant. This wasn't just revenge. Varga wanted her to come to him. He was waiting. And now she had no choice but to finish what she started. She pressed her hands to Frank's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "I'm getting you out of here." Frank shook his head. "Don't. You know where this is headed. You don't have time." Olivia clenched her jaw. I'm not leaving you. I'll be fine, Frank rasped. But if you don't end this now, he'll never stop. Titan let out a soft growl, pacing near the door. The urgency in his stance told her everything she needed to know. She had to go. She had to end this. Olivia squeezed Frank's hand, then stood, her heart hammering in her chest. Varga had drawn her into his game. Now it was time to flip the board. She turned to Titan, gripping his harness. Let's go. Titan huffed in response, his muscles coiling. Together they disappeared into the night. They were hunting now, and this time they wouldn't stop until Varga was finished for good. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal exterior swallowed in the darkness. Olivia stood outside, heart pounding, Titan's leash wrapped tightly around her hand. This was it, the end of the chase. Jason Varga was inside, waiting for her, just as he had planned. But he had made one critical mistake. He thought she was the prey. Titan stood beside her, his breath steady, muscles taut with anticipation. He knew the moment was near. Olivia had spent years training him for situations like this, situations where hesitation meant death. And now, as she took a slow breath, steadying herself against the lingering pain in her wounded shoulder, she knew there was no turning back. She moved forward, silent and calculated, her boots barely making a sound against the gravel. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, just enough to invite her in. A trap. But she already knew that. She pushed it open, slipping inside. The interior was dark, lit only by a few hanging bulbs that cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. Crates and old machinery lined the walls, creating the perfect maze for an ambush. The air was thick with dust, tinged with the faint metallic scent of oil and rust. And then, a slow clap echoed through the space. Olivia Monroe, a voice drawled from the shadows. She turned, every muscle locked in anticipation. Jason Varga stepped into the light, dressed in a crisp black suit that felt out of place in the industrial decay around him. His salt-and-pepper hair was slicked back, his eyes sharp with amusement. He looked untouched by time, as if prison had only sharpened him rather than broken him. "I have to admit," he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "You put up more of a fight than I expected, but then again, you always were stubborn." Olivia didn't respond. She was already scanning the space, counting exits, listening for movement. She knew Varga never worked alone. "You came alone?" he asked, feigning disappointment. "No backup? No cavalry?" A slow smirk curled at the edges of Olivia's lips. "I brought a friend." Titan growled low in his throat, stepping forward, his gaze locked onto Varga like a predator sizing up its kill. Varga chuckled. "Ah, yes, the famous dog." He tilted his head. "Do you know why I never liked K9 units, Monroe? Too loyal, too predictable." Olivia's grip on Titan's leash tightened. "You want to talk about predictable? Let me guess. You lure me here, waste time with monologues, then your guys jump me from the shadows?" Varga grinned. "Something like that." A flicker of movement. Olivia felt it before she saw it. A figure lunging from the darkness, gun raised. Titan moved first. A blur of muscle and teeth, a savage snarl cutting through the silence as he took the man down in an instant. A gunshot rang out, ricocheting off metal, but Olivia was already moving. She spun, kicking out the attacker's legs before he could fire again. The gun skidded across the floor. Titan pinned him, jaws clamping onto his forearm, a scream ripping from his throat. Varga didn't flinch. "Impressive," he mused, watching as his man writhed beneath Titan's grip. "But I wouldn't get too comfortable." Another shadow moved, another attacker. This one was faster, but Olivia was ready. She ducked as the man swung, using his own momentum to slam him into a rusted crate. He groaned, staggering, and she grabbed the back of his head, driving him forward into the metal. He dropped. Titan released the first man, stepping back as Olivia turned to Varga. They were alone now. The air between them was charged, humming with something unspoken. Varga sighed, rolling his shoulders. You really are relentless, aren't you? You should have stayed in prison, Olivia said coldly. He smirked. Maybe. But where's the fun in that? In a flash, he moved, faster than she expected. A knife gleamed in his hand. Olivia twisted, barely dodging the first strike. The blade nicked her side, pain blooming sharp and hot. She clenched her jaw, stepping back. Varga pressed forward, slashing again. She ducked, blocked, countered. Titan snarled, circling, waiting for her signal. Varga lashed out. Olivia caught his wrist, twisting hard. The knife clattered to the floor. She drove a knee into his ribs. He grunted but didn't go down. Instead, he grabbed her injured shoulder, digging his fingers into the wound. White-hot agony shot through her. For the first time, she faltered. Varga smirked, shoving her back. She stumbled, catching herself against a crate. I always wondered, he said, wiping blood from his lip. What would happen when you finally ran out of luck? Olivia forced herself to stand, forced herself to push through the pain. She glanced at Titan. The moment their eyes met, he knew. She gave a single nod. Titan lunged. Varga barely had time to react before Titan was on him, jaws locking around his arm. He screamed, trying to shake him off, but Titan was unyielding. Olivia moved in, driving a punch into Varga's jaw. He staggered, another hit, this time to his ribs. He dropped to his knees, gasping. Titan released him, stepping back. Varga groaned, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. Go ahead, he spat, breathless. Finish it. Olivia stared down at him, chest heaving. She could end it now. A single move, a final strike. But she wasn't like him. She never would be. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out her phone. Dialed. 911, what's your emergency? She didn't look away from Varga. I have a fugitive in custody, she said, voice steady. Jason Varga. I'll be waiting at the docks. Varga laughed, shaking his head. You really are something else, Monroe. She crouched down, eyes cold. You came after me, after my people. Her voice was razor sharp. This is me making sure you never get another chance. Varga met her gaze. Something flickered there. Recognition. She had won. Sirens wailed in the distance. Titan sat beside her, ears pricked, muscles still tight with anticipation. But Olivia ran a hand down his back, calming him. It was over. For the first time in years, she felt it. The weight lifting. The past finally letting go. As the red and blue lights washed over the docks, Olivia exhaled. She wasn't running anymore, and she never would again. Not all battles are fought with fists. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground and face the past head on. What would you do if the ghosts of your past came knocking? Would you fight? Would you run? Or would you, like Olivia, refuse to be hunted? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the best stories aren't just told, they're lived. Turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling tale. See you in the next one.